It's perhaps unsurprising that people in developing countries with more currency crises, I think, intuitively get it a lot quicker. And I think also that's why the book, Check Your Financial Privilege, the title makes sense, because people that are in relatively stable currency regimes are not necessarily going to be the first people to understand why something Bitcoin has interesting global implications and might be something that is demanded worldwide.
You're listening to Because of Bitcoin, a podcast that shares the personal stories of how Bitcoin is having a real impact in people's lives, including mine. I'm your host, Mauricio Di Bartolomeo, the co-founder and CSO of Lyn. And without further ado, let's get started with today's story. Our experiences when we're young tend to have a big influence on who we become later in life. Some are luckier than others in this regard in getting a head start, but life can be magical in that with hard work and dedication, almost anyone can make their dreams come true. And today's story is a great example of that. In this episode, I'm excited to be joined by Lyn Alden, an engineer, investor, and writer whose research and commentary reaches hundreds of thousands of people every day. She retired at the young age of 33 from her career in engineering, and since then, she's been an investor and independent researcher. And how she got there is one of the most inspiring stories I've ever heard. She founded Lyn Alden Investment Strategy in 2016 and started writing about Bitcoin in 2017. Her Bitcoin content made waves in the community almost instantly, with a clean and clear style that resonated with many. Lyn's work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Business Network, Money Watch, Times Money Magazine, and many more. I've been a long-time admirer of Lyn's work, and this was a very special conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Lyn, I'm a huge fan of your work, and I think you have actually one of the most inspiring stories that I've heard. I thought it would be great if maybe we could start at the beginning, if you could share a little bit about your childhood.
Yeah, my childhood was, kind of complicated, right? So, there's basically, it was separation of parents, and then it was, different degrees of kind of financial struggle. And so, for example, I spent several years as a kid living with my mother, and we had various levels of homelessness. So we moved around to different homeless shelters. At one point, we lived in a car. Eventually, I transitioned over to living with my father instead. And there's a whole history there, but basically then I grew up in a trailer park with him. So it was more financially stable, but it was still a pretty modest, kind of lifestyle. From there I had a, pretty happy childhood. Even when I was homeless, I mean, one thing I like to stress is that my mom, she took really good care of me. Just that, we were running into basically just, social challenges and financial challenges. And so I had a, kind of a loving childhood, but certainly a turbulent one.
You wrote an amazing blog post about it, which I personally would recommend everybody to read because it's actually one of the most inspiring pieces that I've ever read. And it speaks to that. The title of the blog post is What Being Homeless Taught Me About Money and Happiness. And you can find it linked in the show notes below. I've seen a lot of people, as I've grown up, life kind of puts obstacles in your way, and you may be born with a set of cards, and then your cards kind of change as you get older. But really, how you react to those challenges is really all the difference, right? Because there are people that will react very differently to a particular challenge, and I think the way that you were able to just continue to learn from everything that you were going through and then kind of put together the pieces to create your personal roadmap, your personal plan, and execute on that plan with such discipline. And it's just admirable. I can't say that enough. There was a line in your blog that says you saw the two halves of your parents and you wanted to essentially put their strengths together to basically not go through their same struggles. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about what you saw, what the better parts of each of them were, and what other sort of kind of superpowers that you combined, and maybe how that relates to this concept of having this financial house in order.
One way to describe it is that if any step along the way of like earning money, saving money, and then investing money and growing money is disrupted, then the entire process ends up getting disrupted. And so, one thing I emphasize is that my father, for example, was he was able to earn income a moderate income, but it was a reliable one. And then he was a good saver, but he was not like a compounder. He basically made certain poor investment decisions. You know, he never really was in the mindset of trying to create wealth. Is always just making sure that there was, like, say, you know, half a year or a year's worth of savings, and then that's kind of sufficient. Whereas my mother, I mean, she was, especially in her early years, better pursuing income and a little bit more focused on her career and focused on growth in that sense. But her downside was the saving part. The thing I tried to emphasize is that it's, you know, it's about trying to find an income that, you know, works for you, but that is pushing you, so that you have that margin to save more. But then also building that mindset of, you know, low time preference is now the you know, the common term. But back then I didn't use that term. But basically changing your time preference, being a saver, and then making sure that that money is also in something that grows well over time. Then it's not compounding in a bad investment decisions. Unfortunately, what a lot of investors do is they buy into the tops of things and then they sell at the bottom of things, and they kind of you know, underperform a lot of the stock indices or a lot of the other assets that they might be involved with, usually because they're timing it poorly.
It's a fascinating point. And so I guess just to kind of summarize what you said, it's your ability to earn money, it's your ability to put that money away. And then there's the additional fact that you have to put that money away to work for you, and not just have it sit there. Do you think that captures that idea to some degree?
I think so. And especially in the current era where, you know, saving in normal currencies is just not a super viable long-term plan because you're getting interest rates that are below inflation. I had a tragic story of a physician reach out because they're focused on helping people, focused on their career of medicine. They didn't put a lot of emphasis on investing. They mostly saved in cash, and a lot of that cash was unfortunately wiped out. There's a lot of stories like that out there, and it's heartbreaking.
Everyone's talking about inflation right now, and for good reason. But it's not actually something that an 8-year-old typically thinks about unless that 8-year-old is Lyn Alden. I was listening to one of your podcasts, and you mentioned that you started building your own gold coin and silver coin treasury at age 8, which is insane to me, to hear that somebody would start buying something, or you would get to this concept that it makes sense to buy gold or silver at that age. What inspired you to buy that at that age? Were you just experimenting, or what did you read something that made you go, aha?
So I guess a couple factors. One is I was, for whatever reason, aware of the topic of inflation. That was back in a time when you could still get positive real yields, but it was still something that, you know, I was kind of intuitively aware of, is that, you know, these, you know, if you're saving paper currency, you basically look at it like it's literally paper. It's not worth anything. And number two was I started to get interested in coin collecting when I was a kid. I had an uncle that had this extensive coin collection, and it was always fascinating to see coins from different countries. And those weren't, you know, made out of any sort of precious metals. And then eventually, you know, when I would say get little gifts for, you know, holidays or birthdays and things like that, I started to receive some silver ones. And I, you know, basically wanted to pursue that and kind of enhance my coin collection in that direction. And then started becoming more interested in silver and gold, you know, kind of for its own sake. And so I had that kind of early interest in precious metals and the history of money.
And you said that you were aware of inflation at the time. Like, do you remember at all? Was there at any moment, was it your uncle that collected metals that told you that you should save in them? Like, was there a mentor or something that made it click for you before you bought them, or was it just that as you saw the value go up once you got them as gifts that reinforced this idea?
I think it was just. It might have been just math class, even, like, you know, when you're a kid and you're doing like little word problems about, you know, compounding or things like that. I was always, you know, I was kind of ahead of the curve in math. And so we'd have a thing like, okay, if you save it this much, what happens over this many years? And there'd be like, you know, an inflation component. And I was like, oh, so it basically, like, you get yield from a bank, but also the money itself kind of loses value. And so it's hard to remember exactly especially when you're that young, where the spark came from. But it was something that for whatever reason I was, you know, aware of that history of inflation.
When you started buying gold, what happened? Like, did you find the prices of your coins went up, and that kind of reinforced this idea that investing was a smart decision? Like, how was that feedback loop from what you were reading in theory and what was playing out in after you made your investment decisions?
The funny thing is I didn't even check the price that often. That was actually back. It was kind of in hindsight, a lucky time to start, because that was back when, you know, gold was only a few $100s an ounce, and silver was very cheap. And for that meme, like one Bitcoin is one Bitcoin. When I was a kid, it was kind of like one silver coin is one silver coin. It's like I'm not checking the dollar price, and so I wasn't obsessing over the fiat price, and so I think for me it was just about stacking. It was about basically adding to my collection rather than the feedback of price itself. I was basically aware that the dollar itself has historically been one of the stronger currencies, but I still understood that it devalues over the very long term. I knew that it used to be tied to gold, but then was decoupled. I didn't know the full story, but I was like, and it was the dollar that went down compared to gold rather than the other way around. So I still understood a lot of the basics, even though I wasn't more like stacking rather than actively thinking about it and trading and just frequent price checking.
But it's actually insane to me that you could have that conviction at that young age to just not even look at price. Like, it took me years, not years, but it took me some time to get to even that conviction with Bitcoin, from the moment I started reading about it till the moment I bought it. And now I just don't look at price, right? I just have it, I hold it, and I don't necessarily think about it, because to your point, the conviction is so high that it's just a matter of time. Over the last 3 years, Lyn has continued to bring a unique perspective on Bitcoin, given her deep understanding of macroeconomics, precious metals, and her unique life experiences. This unique perspective has helped her become one of the most important voices in the Bitcoin investment community over the last 3 years. When did you first come across Bitcoin?
Kind of embarrassingly early. And I say embarrassing because I didn't buy it, obviously, till later. But I came across it probably around, it might have been late 2010. And I had a friend that could mine it on her computer. And I thought, oh, I should, I have a graphics card, I should do that. And just didn't. You know how like a lot of people say that they had to encounter it multiple times before they really kind of they got it. And then I kind of revisited a few years later. It's like a few $100s per coin. And back then I just kind of was like, oh, that's like that libertarian money, it's neat. Like I'm rooting for those guys, but I don't know how to value it. And I was like, can't you copy it? Like, how do I know that there's not going to be another one come along that's better? And they could just be like market dilution. You could have 50 of these things, and they all have 2% market share, and how do they hold value? And then it was during that huge 2017 bull run, it became large enough that as an investment researcher at the time, I had to start taking it seriously as an asset class. And my analysis at the time was, it's really interesting technology. I was like, it's interesting, but I would just be very careful of position sizes, because it's I don't really consider it a good investment. And that ended up working out pretty well, because of course you had a blow off top, but then you had a crash, and they generally underperformed most other assets for the next 2 years or more. But I kept tabs on the industry. I kept looking into it, and specifically the kind of the resolution of that block size war. Why Bitcoin went out over Bitcoin Cash, and what were the trade-offs there, and why why did that go the way it went? Kind of, I think, led me to the realization of how rather immutable Bitcoin is. And I think that realization, along with network effect analysis, is what made me kind of become more convicted on Bitcoin. At least forced me to then start looking a lot more into the underlying details and what makes it unique. And so I've been really since late 2019, I started to get more bullish on it. But that I didn't buy it until that crash in 2020, the COVID crash. That's when I started buying my first Bitcoins. It was actually the precious metal background that I think that let me solve it, because during that crash, I watched gold go down, and I watched silver in particular crash. And I was like, as soon as this gets reliquefied, these things are going to pop back up. And I saw that Bitcoin was doing the same thing. I was like, it looks like silver. It's like, it's like this straight line down. And I was like, as soon as this like deflationary, like crunch liquidity crisis thing's behind us, this thing's probably going to shoot back up. That kind of background and being familiar with precious metals, I think, helped me identify, kind of a good buying opportunity for Bitcoin.
That's really, really fascinating. It was interesting because the recovery from the COVID crash, I think, was faster than a lot of people expected it would be. And it's fascinating to see that there were people like yourselves that in the context of all of this, you really literally bought when there was blood in the water, right? And that requires, again, a great deal of conviction to have that poise to act in those circumstances. How would you say Bitcoin has impacted your life professionally?
Well, so I think because it's still a relatively small industry, most companies are still in the startup realm rather than these, public corporations, and so you can have pretty good access to people from different companies. If you have some sort of platform or if you just reach out, and so I generally found that it certainly added complexity to my professional work because I had to spin up on this whole new technology, money implications, not just the details of Bitcoin, but then also stable coins. And then also what does this mean maybe for the long-term banking system, or what does it mean for other monetary assets? And so one, it added a lot of extra hours of work, but it was rewarding. But then professionally, it opened doors to meet people that are working on it at a pretty deep level in different areas. And I've been very kind of grateful. And then it also, I think, crystallized my view towards human rights. That's always been a big thing for me, but it kind of, I think, forced me to think more globally in that regard. And so basically meeting people that I think are doing really important work in human rights and how they can potentially use Bitcoin and stable coins and other tools like that in their work. Yeah, it's been huge in that sense, and it's funny because it's by far the most controversial asset that I have an opinion on, right? So there are people that say stopped following my work because I emphasized that I was bullish on it, but then of course there's a bunch of new followers that came in and said, oh, because I was not known in the Bitcoin space, and now I have some followers from that space. So it's just I just try to be objective and put my work out there.
That's great. And shout out to Alex Gladstein of the Human Rights Foundation. That's the Oslo Freedom Forum is one of the best events I've ever been to. And that's where I think we had the pleasure to meet. To that point specifically, to me, I've been very, very grateful, especially because of the people. I think being able to work in Bitcoin is very fulfilling because I feel that I get to do work that impacts people back home. I'm no longer in Venezuela physically, but I can do work that helps people in different parts of the world. And I have to say that is probably one of the things I enjoy the most about being in the Bitcoin space. When you were starting to learn about Bitcoin, where did you go to learn about Bitcoin? But is there anything that you read that stood out to you, or anything that you would suggest to somebody that wants to get perhaps a better understanding of Bitcoin?
For me, it was not a book was not an entry point. It was more like podcasts. I think were kind of how I spun up on things. I mean, obviously I read the white paper. I think the rise of Bitcoin podcasts was how I kind of first understood it. And then once I listened to them, I also went and read some of the books. But for me, that kind of came later rather than a starting point.
Was there any podcast that you like that's still around that you would recommend?
Yeah, I came across Peter McCormack's podcast. Saw Preston Pish talking about it, especially because Preston had a value investing background. I think that spoke to me to some extent, right? You find an entry point that kind of bridges gaps, right? So if you're a value investor and you see another value investor who's interested in it, that might kind of entice you to look into it more. And so for me, it was kind of like some either just the biggest Bitcoin podcast, because those tend to be the first ones you kind of come across, or it's existing podcasts that you knew, like say Preston's, that you then hear talking about it.
That's actually a really great insight. And I'm a huge fan of both Peter and Preston. And we'll put the links down below on the show notes for people to check them out. How would you think that a North American investor, would look at Bitcoin? Would it be like a hedge on inflation, or a growth vehicle, like a risky growth stock, or from value investing standpoint or viewpoint, how do you categorize Bitcoin in a portfolio?
So I think most people would think of it as a speculation, or like the equivalent of like a tech stock, right? And then their first thought is, well, there's Bitcoin, but then there's all these others. Maybe those can give better returns. And then they look into the altcoins, and that's kind of that whole pathway happens. For me, I treat it more like kind of more in the precious metal camp, basically, or commodity, something that doesn't have profit margins you need to worry about, but of course you're instead looking at general supply and demand characteristics, assessments of the network effect, and if it's going to retain and grow market share and then grow the pie as a whole. Is more outside capital going to want to go into the space? And it's perhaps unsurprising that people in developing countries with more currency crises, I think intuitively get it a lot quicker, and I think think also that's why, the book, Check Your Financial Privilege, the title makes sense because, people that are in relatively stable currency regimes are not necessarily going to be the first people to understand why something Bitcoin is globally, has interesting global implications and might be something that is demanded worldwide. They think, well, we have money. Like, why do we need other payment apps? Why do we need to save in something else? We can just put money into a 401k and, diversified stocks and real estate that always goes up. And, that's kind of, I think, the framework that a lot of people in developed countries look at it. And so chain analysis shows that, I don't think they break it down into say Bitcoin specifically, but their crypto adoption index, like 19 out of 20 countries in the top 20 are developing countries. They'd be classified as emerging markets or frontier markets, and the only one developed country on the top 20 is the United States. And I think it's we kind of approach that for different directions. So I view it. For most people, if I sell the idea, it's the idea of having a non-zero position. If you were to have, say, gold, you might then have gold and Bitcoin alongside your stocks, your cash, your real estate, whatever else you might have. Whereas, I think the message is quite different in other markets, especially where they have, in many cases, people don't invest in stocks in their local country, whereas it's quite common in the United States. And so I think the message has to be tailored to the things that the audience understands.
That's a really, really good point. And because I actually think it's unsurprising that the countries that have very accessible equity markets, like say the United States or even parts of Korea, right? Like they see tokens and Bitcoin as just another thing to trade. And that's why, many exchanges are, feel a lot like equity exchanges. They have all these options, like the similar setup, right? Versus when you think of someone like a value investor looking at Bitcoin, they're looking at it more like a commodity, right? Like this, almost like a public utility, or this resource, this internet resource that can move money, or internet protocol that can move money. And I think, to your point, in places like Venezuela, where no one has ever seen a stock, no one has ever bought a stock, the Caracas Stock Exchange is virtually accessible by no one. People's innate sort of reaction is, this is money, right? Versus the people that have traded stocks in the past and are used to them, they'll see it as potentially another stock. And that's actually pretty, I find that to be true, especially in LATAM, because generally speaking, LATAM has very little access to local equities, and the only people that can get into US equities are the hyper rich. And so to them, it's not really representative. But I find that a lot of young people here have equity, and no surprise when they see Bitcoin, they say, well, why don't I buy Dogecoin? Like they almost treat them as similar, right? Like they look at it as, what stock can go up higher? What's the AMC of this world? And I find that, like you mentioned, it's very related to how close you are to stocks locally. It can kind of influence that view. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I think a lot of people don't understand that most of the world doesn't have access to, easy stock market investing still. And even if they did, that, in many cases, because of the structure of the reserve currency status and how, we kind of have global money just pouring into our stock market, that ours has been better performing than average over the past 40 years. Whereas many stock markets, have gone like sideways for 10, 15 years now, in some cases longer. And so a lot of people in the world either don't have access to equities, or it's just equities have not been the gains, the performers that Americans are used to from stocks that, just seem like they always go up. And of course, we know that's not the case forever, but there are multi-decade periods where that can be the case. And so it kind of, I think people don't realize that that's not normal. That's kind of an anomaly.
You spend a lot of time, which I believe you invest a lot of time, to share your knowledge and to help people learn and get better and better understand economics and finance. Like, what makes that fire burn? Like, what motivates you to just be so altruistic and just, write such great content?
If you're passionate about something, it doesn't feel like work. A lot of times I want to explore something And if you're studying something on your own, and this is why universities still have value, even though most of the information you can get online. If there's no kind of catalyst to actually finish it or to get through the hard parts, you're more likely to just not do it. And I generally find that if I want to learn something challenging about economics or economic history or kind of put some pieces together, if I can't explain it to others, then I don't understand it myself yet. Basically, that motivation to publish and answer questions I'm getting in emails and answer questions I'm seeing posed, or kind of get to the heart of a riddle. For me, writing is how I both educate myself and others. And then also, I think it's just the fact that we live in such crazy times in terms of financial history. I think we're kind of undergoing somewhat of a shift in the monetary system. Kind of a fourth turning type of event, or like a change in how global finance is structured, which tends to happen every 50 years or so. Call it. Obviously, it depends on the details, but generally, as technology changes and as geopolitics change and as things change, we go through these evolutions of how we structure the global interconnections of money and how financial markets work. And so, because there's so much going on, I just try to kind of monitor that, analyze it, and then share what I'm learning, rather than say focusing on managing money, which is primarily something you do for high net worth individuals. Whereas if you focus on providing research and public research, then you're actually, in my view, helping like a much broader audience.
That's very, very fascinating, and I'm a subscriber of both your premium and free accounts. They are amazing. I strongly recommend them to anyone looking to learn and stay on top of all of this. It's a great deal of information, but it's all presented in a way that is very easy to read and understand. What would you say to somebody that is maybe not entirely happy with their finances right now and is looking to make things a little bit better for them or their family? Like, is there kind of one piece of advice that resonated for you, or any kind of tip?
I think for me, the biggest thing from the beginning was always having a side hustle. And I guess one way to phrase that is you don't really get ahead if you do an average amount. And so if you're kind of feel like you're stuck in a rut financially, at least initially, it's hard work that is then directed in a smart direction is a way they can kickstart it. So obviously, one is to plug any obvious leaks you have in terms of major unnecessary spending and things like that. But then for a lot of people, it comes down to trying to figure out how to get the top line up. And then sometimes those side hustles can become whole new careers. Basically, I think most people should try to be somewhat diversified, to have multiple, skills and knowledge sets that they build. And so, if someone's ever considering changing their career, or they're looking for ways to increase their income, we luckily live in a world where, the tools for running a small business or some sort of small work you can do on the side are more accessible than ever. And so I think, one of my first go-to pieces is to, consider ways to do that, because, if you can increase your income by 10% or 20% and you keep your expenses the same, then your savings rate can go up, 50% or 100%, depending on what your saving margin was before. And so a seemingly small difference can actually make a huge difference in terms of long-term compounding and saving.
As we get towards the end of the show, is there anything you want to share or can share about what's next for you professionally?
Well, I still plan on doing what I've been doing, which is providing public research. One thing I've been emphasizing a little bit more over the past year is some work in the startup space in Bitcoin. And so I'm on independent director for Swan Bitcoin, and then I'm also an advisor to Ego Death Capital, where we're basically raising money and then trying to build out some second layer infrastructure on Bitcoin. For me, it's interesting not just to write about something, but then to also, in some tiny way, maybe to help shape some of it. I think it also kind of brings back some of my engineering background, because I think naturally I generally want to feel like I'm building something rather than just writing about it. And so I've been focusing a little bit more on that building side, or at least helping the different pieces get together to have building be done.
Well, that's great. I actually, so we're big fans of the Swan team. Love that you're getting more involved in the Bitcoin. I'm sure we as a community will be very grateful to have more and more of Lyn. It would be great. we could be going on for hours, but maybe we're going to leave it here for now. And maybe can we tell people, I'm going to put all the links for all of your websites and everything below, but can you tell people where they can find you or where they can learn more about your work?
So I'm at lynalden.com. That's where they can find most of my work. And I'm also on Twitter at Lyn Alden Contact.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Lyn. Really, really appreciate you having you on. And I'm sure people that listen will find a lot of valuable stuff in here. Thanks again, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks. I really appreciate it.
There are many bright minds in the Bitcoin community, and Lyn is certainly one of the brightest. Her work has helped many, myself included, better understand macroeconomic concepts and how they impact Bitcoin. As Lyn's story shows us, with education and perseverance, you can get almost anywhere in life. Knowledge is power, and you can gain that knowledge by being diligent and disciplined about your financial education and your financial habits. Her understanding of the current financial system and its flaws allowed her to see the potential in Bitcoin's gold-like properties and break down the investment case for her readers at an opportune time. She is a sought-after voice in the Bitcoin community and someone who will undoubtedly continue making a huge impact in the industry as it grows. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Lyn as much as I did, and as always, all of the resources and books we mentioned in the episode will be available in the show notes. Huge thank you to Lyn for joining me, and thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this Because of Bitcoin episode, I would be very grateful for the 5 seconds it would take you to drop us a review and give us a rating on your favorite podcasting platform. This will really help us reach even more listeners. And if you'd like to learn more about Bitcoin, be sure to check out our newsletter by subscribing at ledn.io. That's ledn.io. Again, this was Mauricio Di Bartolomeo. Stay tuned for our next episode. And until then, muchas gracias y los quiero mucho. Chao, chao.